The world had shrunk to the size of a table, warped and stained with the ghosts of spilled whiskey and bitter regrets. Dust motes danced like frantic spirits in the thick shafts of saloon light, each one a witness to May's degradation. She stood by the wall, a ghost herself in a borrowed dress, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white stones. She was not a person. She was a pot, the final, desperate ante thrown in by a man whose luck had long since fled. His name was Jasper, and his clammy grip on her arm hours ago had felt like the first touch of the grave. Now, his face was a slack mask of ruin as the last card was turned. Across the table, the man they called Caleb stared at his hand. He was a pillar of shadow against the bar's grimy mirror, his face obscured by the brim of a sweat-stained hat. He was drunk. The whole town knew his habits. He drank to forget a name, a past, a reason to be. Tonight he drank to win. And he had. A king-high flush, spread like a bloody fan on the green felt. A collective sigh, part relief and part disappointment, breathed through the room. Jasper slumped, a puppet with his strings cut. The other men grunted, scraping their chairs back. For them, the spectacle was over. But for May, the true terror was just beginning. Caleb raked the meager pile of coins toward him with an unsteady hand. His eyes, when he finally lifted them, were a startling, sharp blue in his sun-scorched face. They were not the hazy, unfocused eyes of a common drunk. They were chips of ice, holding a sliver of some terrible, banked fire. They swept over the coins, then settled on her. He didn't smile. He didn't leer. He simply looked, his gaze a physical weight. "The pot's all mine, Jasper." Caleb's voice was a low rasp, graveled with liquor and disuse. "Everything on the table." Jasper couldn't even look at her. "She's yours." The words were a death sentence, whispered into the foul air. May felt the room tilt. The jeering faces of the onlookers swam in and out of focus. This was it. This was the end of the small, fragile life she had tried to build from the ashes of her family's railroad dreams. To be owned by a man like this, a violent, unpredictable drunkard whose only reputation was the speed of his gun and the depth of his despair. She prepared for the rough hand, the command, the public humiliation of being led away like livestock. Her breath hitched, a tiny, trapped bird in her chest. She forced her chin up, a last, futile act of defiance. If she was to be broken, she would meet the blow with her eyes open. Caleb pushed his chair back, the screech of wood on wood cutting through the murmur. He stood, his height silencing the room completely. He walked not to the bar for a triumphant drink, but straight towards her. He was close enough now that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, the dust of the trail on his clothes. He stopped a foot away. His shadow consumed her. He was not just a man. He was an omen, a force of nature as harsh and unforgiving as the land itself. He stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching into an eternity. May's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down her final seconds of self-possession. Then he spoke, his voice low, meant only for her. "Come." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a snarl of possession. It was a simple, flat statement of fact. And as he turned, expecting her to follow, she felt a tremor of something other than fear. It was a cold, sharp spike of dread. Yes, but beneath it, a sliver of utter bewilderment. His eyes held no triumph, only a vast, desolate emptiness. The walk through the single, dusty street of redemption was a new kind of torment. The setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the clapboard storefronts in hues of orange and blood. Windows became eyes, doorways gaping mouths. The townsfolk, those who hadn't been inside the saloon, stopped to watch the procession. A woman's sharp gasp, a man's low, cruel chuckle. May saw their judgment, their pity, their satisfaction. She was the outsider, the china doll, now the gunslinger's property. Her shame was a physical cloak, heavy and suffocating. She focused on the back of Caleb's worn leather vest, the straight line of his shoulders. He didn't look at the gawkers. He didn't seem to notice them at all, moving with a purpose that felt strangely sober for a man who had just drunk the saloon dry. He led her past the last trappings of the town, the blacksmith's silent forge, the livery stable, the undertaker's discreet shingle, and onto a path that wound into the low, scrub-covered hills. The silence out here was different. It wasn't the charged, watchful silence of the town. It was an ancient, indifferent quiet, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the dry earth and the rising cry of crickets. The cabin was small, brutal in its simplicity. Hewn from rough timber, it seemed to have grown from the hillside rather than been built upon it. A stone chimney stood sentinel at one end, a plume of cold smoke forgotten against the deepening twilight. He pushed the door open and stood aside, a gesture so devoid of threat it was disorienting. May hesitated on the threshold. Inside, the single room was sparse, almost monastic. A narrow cot, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and shelves holding a few tins and a stack of worn books. It was clean. Improbably, meticulously clean. There was a smell of wood smoke and dried herbs, not stale liquor. He followed her in, his presence immediately shrinking the small space. He gestured with his chin toward a closed door she hadn't noticed. "That room is yours," he crossed to the fireplace, his movements economical, and lit a lantern. The warm, yellow light pushed back the shadows, revealing the starkness of his life. There was no clutter, no sign of another person, no hint of comfort. It was the space of a man waiting for nothing. He turned back to her, and for the first time, she saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes. The alcohol was a mask, and it was beginning to slip. "There is water in the pitcher." A blanket on the bed, he didn't look at her as he spoke. His gaze fixed on the flickering flame of the lantern. "No one will bother you here." He picked up a half-empty bottle of whiskey from the mantelpiece and his gun belt from a hook by the door. Without another word, he walked back outside, pulling the main door shut behind him.
May stood frozen, listening.
She heard him settle onto the porch steps, the groan of the wood under his weight. She expected the sound of a cork being pulled, the glug of liquor. Instead, there was only the vast, overwhelming silence of the night. She crept to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. She could see his silhouette, head in his hands, staring out into the darkness. He wasn't drinking. He was just sitting there, a man locked in a prison of his own making. Slowly, cautiously, she opened the door to the room he had indicated. It was little more than a closet, containing a small straw mattress on a low frame. But on it, as he'd said, was a neatly folded wool blanket. It was clean. It was hers. The door had a simple wooden latch on the inside. Her fingers trembled as she slid it into place. The sound was a small, definitive click in the quiet cabin. It wasn't freedom, but it was a reprieve, a breath. In the suffocating darkness, she sank onto the mattress, the terror of the past day finally crashing over her in a silent, shuddering wave. She wept without sound, her grief a private, bitter thing. She had been won, claimed, and brought to the home of a monster. But the monster had given her a blanket, a locked door, and the mercy of his absence. The contradiction was a seed of confusion planted in the barren soil of her despair, and she didn't know if it was a promise of hope or just a more refined form of cruelty. Days bled into one another, each sunrise painting the harsh landscape in soft, forgiving light before the midday sun baked it back to brass. May lived in the spaces Caleb did not occupy. When he left at dawn to work a small, stubborn plot of land carved out of the rocky soil behind the cabin, she would emerge from her room. She swept the floors. She scrubbed the single table until the wood grain showed clean and pale. She found a small vegetable patch, neglected but not yet dead, and began to tend it, her fingers finding solace in the familiar feel of the earth. She did these things not from a sense of servitude, but from a desperate need for order, a way to impose her will on at least one small corner of a world that had tried to erase her. She cooked simple meals from his sparse larder of beans and flour, supplemented with the tough greens she coaxed from the garden. She would leave a plate on the table for him, and when he returned at dusk, caked in dirt and sweat, he would eat in silence. He never thanked her. He never commented. But one evening, She found a bolt of plain blue cotton cloth on her mattress. The next week, a small bag of rice. They were transactions, perhaps acknowledgments of her labor. But they were also something more. They were a language. He was a creature of routine and silence. She learned him not through words, but through observation. She saw the way his hands, so steady with a hoe or an axe, would sometimes tremble when he thought she wasn't looking. She saw the locket he wore on a leather cord around his neck, a silver oval he would touch absently, his face hardening into a mask of old pain. He never touched the whiskey bottle on the mantel. It sat there like a monument to a battle already won, or one he was still fighting every single day. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the plains, the sky turning the color of a bruise. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the dry creek bed into a raging torrent. Caleb came in early, soaked to the bone, tracking mud across her clean floor. He stopped, looked at the mud, then at her. For the first time, his eyes held something like apology. "Sorry," he mumbled, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. He took off his boots on the porch. The small courtesy was a seismic event in their silent world. That night, the storm howled, rattling the shutters and making the small cabin feel like a ship on a violent sea. The fire in the hearth was their only anchor. He sat at the table, cleaning his pistol with methodical, practiced movements. May sat in the other chair, mending one of his shirts, the needle a tiny silver fish darting through the rough fabric. The silence was thick, but it was no longer menacing. It was shared. "You can read?" he asked suddenly, his voice startling her. He nodded toward the stack of books on the shelf. She looked up from her sewing, surprised. "A little. My father taught me. He was a railroad man." It was the most he had ever asked. "Yes, a scholar in our homeland. Here, a laborer." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with all that was left unsaid. He finished with his gun, reassembling it with a final, definitive click. He looked at her, his gaze direct, unsettling. "You should not have been at that table. Jasper owed money," she said simply, her voice barely a whisper. "I was all he had left." Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked away, into the fire, his profile carved by the flickering light. Some debts shouldn't be paid. The storm raged outside. But inside, something had shifted. The wall of silence had been breached, not by a flood, but by a few carefully chosen stones being removed. He saw her as more than a possession, and she saw, in the rigid set of his shoulders and the deep-etched lines on his face, not a monster, but a man carrying a burden so heavy it had stooped his soul. Later, when the storm had passed and the moon cast a watery light through the window, she heard a sound from his cot, a soft, choked noise, a nightmare. She lay still, listening, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. He was a man haunted by more than just drink. He was haunted by ghosts she couldn't see, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something akin to empathy for the man who had won her in a poker game. The unspoken truce held for weeks. A rhythm of shared solitude established itself, fragile but persistent. The garden began to yield more than just tough greens. A few pale tomatoes, some misshapen squash. May took pride in them, arranging them on the windowsill like jewels. One evening, Caleb returned from town with not just supplies, but a small, paper-wrapped parcel. He placed it on the table without a word and went to wash at the basin outside. Inside the paper was a comb. Not a cheap wooden one, but one of carved bone, smooth and cool to the touch. It was an extravagance, a thing of beauty in their stark world. May held it, her throat tight. It was the first gift she had received that was not for utility, but for her. It was an acknowledgement of her as a woman, not just a presence in his house. The gesture cracked open a part of her she had thought long dead. That night, she used the comb, drawing it through her long, black hair until it shone in the lamplight. She felt a flicker of her former self, the girl who had once dared to dream. The next day, he was fixing a broken hinge on the door, his brow furrowed in concentration. The silver locket he always wore slipped from beneath his shirt, swinging on its cord. He didn't notice, but she did. It was the first time she had seen it so clearly. It was old, dented, the silver worn smooth with countless touches. It seemed to pulse with a secret life of its own. He dropped the tool, and as he bent to retrieve it, the locket swung forward, the clasp hitting the floor and springing open. A tiny, faded portrait was visible for a fleeting second before he snatched it, his movements sharp with alarm and shame. He fumbled to close it, his back to her, but it was too late. She had seen the face. A woman with kind eyes and hair the color of wheat, her smile gentle. "Leave it," he rasped, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. But she didn't move. She couldn't. His fierce protection of this image, this ghost, resonated with her own carefully guarded memories of her parents. His grief was a language she understood perfectly. He didn't turn around. He stood with his shoulders slumped, a statue of defeat. He began to speak, his voice low and ragged, addressed not to her but to the ghost in the locket. "I should have been there. I should have. I told you I'd be back." His words dissolved into a choked whisper, a litany of regret. He was lost, adrift in a memory so powerful it had consumed him. He sank onto a chair, his head in his hands, the locket clutched in his fist. And then he murmured a phrase so faint she almost missed it. A string of words in a language she knew as well as her own. Tian Liang Lu, Biu Pa Lu. The world stopped. The air in the cabin grew thin. May's blood ran cold, then hot. The words, those words, they were a key, unlocking a dusty room in her memory she hadn't entered in years. She saw a small, sick room in the back of her mother's laundry. A white woman, frail and gasping for breath, her skin translucent. Caleb's mother, and her own mother, holding the woman's hand, murmuring those exact words of comfort in her native Mandarin. Words she had then translated for the dying woman. "The sky is bright now. Don't be afraid." May had been a small child, hiding behind a wicker basket, watching this strange, tender moment between two women who shared no language but that of kindness. Caleb looked up, his eyes bleary with unshed tears, and saw her face. He saw the shock, the recognition. He didn't understand. "What is it?" he asked, his voice raw. She took a hesitant step forward. Her own voice was a thread, fragile but clear. She repeated the words back to him, her pronunciation perfect, the tones rising and falling like a half-forgotten song. "Tian Liang Lu, Biu Pa Lu." She paused, then gave him the gift of their meaning, the same way her mother had. She said, "The sky is bright now. Don't be afraid." Caleb stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief, then dawning comprehension. The gunfighter, the drunk, the haunted man, slowly lowered the fist that held the locket. The ice in his eyes finally broke, and a single tear traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He had won a Chinese girl in a poker game, and she had just whispered his mother's final words back to him. The revelation hung in the air between them, shimmering and fragile. It was a bridge built across years of silence and misunderstanding. He didn't speak of it again, not directly, but the change in him was as profound as a shift in season. The haunted look in his eyes receded, replaced by a quiet watchfulness that was now directed at her, not at some inner ghost. The space between them, once measured in feet and silence, was now filled with a shared history, a debt of kindness that had spanned a decade. But peace in a place like redemption is a fleeting thing. A few days later they came. 4 of them, led by Jasper, the man who had lost her. His face was a blotchy tapestry of resentment and cheap liquor. With him was Silas, a burly mule skinner whose eyes had lingered on May with particular cruelty during the card game. They rode up to the cabin not with a hail, but with the menacing quiet of predators. Caleb was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound. He stopped mid-swing, sensing them before he saw them. He set the axe down slowly, deliberately, and turned to face them, his body a tense line. May, who had been hanging laundry, felt a cold dread seize her. She froze, the damp sheet clutched in her hand. "Caleb," Jasper called out, his voice falsely jovial. "We come to talk business." "I'm not buying anything, Jasper." Caleb's tone was flat and cold. Silas spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near Caleb's boots. We ain't sellin'. We're collectin'. You had your fun with her. Now it's our turn. Jasper feels he made a bad bargain. He looked past Caleb, his eyes fixing on May, stripping her bare with their contempt. He's willin' to call his debt to me paid if I take the girl off his hands before Caleb could move. May did something she wouldn't have dared a week ago. She dropped the sheet and walked forward, not to hide behind him, but to stand beside him. Her heart hammered, but her feet were steady. Her presence was a statement. She was not property to be bartered. She was a person, and this was her ground. Caleb shot a quick, surprised glance at her, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of fierce pride. He shifted his stance slightly, placing himself half a step in front of her. She's not part of any bargain, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a deadly low pitch. She's under my protection. You turn your horses around and ride away now, Silas laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. Protectin' a chink? Since when did you become a saint, Caleb? You won her fair and square. We just want what's owed. You're owed nothing. Caleb's hand drifted, hovering inches from the pistol at his hip. The air grew thick, electric with violence. The only thing you'll get here is a grave. But it was May's voice that cut through the tension. It was quiet, yet it carried across the yard with unshakable clarity. I am not a wager. I am not a debt. She looked directly at Jasper, her gaze holding no fear, only a profound and weary contempt. You shamed your own name that night. Do not try to shame her words, her poise, her defiance. It changed the equation. This was no longer about a drunkard's prize. This was about two people standing together against the ugliness of the world. Silas, seeing his power evaporating, grew desperate. Are you gonna let a woman fight your battles, Caleb? He sneered, reaching for his own gun. It was a fatal mistake. Caleb's draw was not a blur of motion. It was a cessation of it. One moment his hand was empty, the next the pistol was level, steady, and loud. The shot was a single, deafening crack. Silas crumpled, clutching a hand that was suddenly a ruin of blood and bone. His own gun falling uselessly into the dust. The other men froze, their faces pale with shock. Caleb didn't even look at Silas whimpering on the ground. His cold blue eyes swept over the remaining men. I said right away, they didn't need to be told a third time. They scrambled to help Silas onto his horse and fled, leaving a cloud of dust and humiliation in their wake. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the chirping of a lone bird. Caleb slowly holstered his pistol. He turned to May, his expression unreadable. He had defended her, shed blood for her. The debt was now his. He looked from her to the distant town, then back. You're not safe here. With me, he said, the words costing him. I have enough money. I can get you a ticket on the stage to San Francisco. You can find your own people there. Start over. He was offering her an escape. An honorable one. He was offering her the freedom he had stolen that night in the saloon. She looked at his face, at the stark cabin that had become a sanctuary, at the small, thriving garden that was a testament to her own resilience. She thought of the cold anonymity of a big city, of being a stranger once more. Here, in this harsh land, with this broken man, she was known. She was seen. My mother taught me to finish what I start, she said softly. She gestured to the garden. The squash is almost ready. A slow understanding dawned in his eyes, a fragile hope. He looked at the home they had accidentally forged from silence and necessity. He nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin. Pact made, a future chosen. As the sun began to set, they stood together, no longer just a man and his winnings, but two survivors looking out at the vast, unforgiving landscape. It was a brutal world, but the sky was clear, and for the first time, neither of them was afraid.